Tom Segura had a running joke in his podcast about Garth Brooks. Basically, the joke was Garth Brooks is so out of touch that something more nefarious must be going on here. Years after the inception of this joke, Tom has become the very thing he used to make fun of. Completely out of touch. Tom was a liked, relatable, and most importantly, funny guy. A few years later, he's seen as the complete opposite of that. His comedic talents now include making fun of poor people, unironically hating said poor people, hating his fans, having meltdowns directed at lower class workers on Twitter, and putting out a comedy special that has a whopping 2.9 out of 10 on IMDb. His downfall has been insane, and his fan base has certainly noticed, with comments on basically every podcast he does referencing his hatred of poor people or just making fun of him. And this is from a guy that, out of the Joe Rogan sphere, had arguably the most success and talent out of anybody. It's weird to see a guy who got to the place where he is because of his humor and a Joe Rogan boost, not just reject the audience he grew, but despise them. Now he's at a point where seemingly nobody likes Tom as a guy. The people who work for him are leaving, there's a huge group of ex-fans who despise him, and even his fellow comedians don't seem to want anything to do with him. He was given the Rogan ticket and he failed. Well, that's only kind of half true. You see, Tom started comedy back in the early 2000s. He actually gained some pretty decent notoriety over the years. However, what really pulled him into the spotlight were his appearances on what would become the biggest podcast of all time, Joe Rogan. Tom was an OG guest on Joe Rogan, but to say Joe made Tom isn't entirely true, as Tom already had a few comedic feathers in his cap. There's a good chance Tom would have been able to make a career out of comedy due to his talent alone. However, there's no way he'd become half as famous as he is now without Rogan. But Joe certainly took him to that next level of famous comedian, a comedian who podcasts. But unlike these other guys who have podcasts, Tom was consistently funny. The consensus was, in the Joe Rogan verse, Tom Segura was one of the legitimately talented comics. Right up there with Joey Diaz and Theo Vaughn. Legally, every comedian needs a podcast, or else they aren't a real comedian. But back in the day, it was kind of a novelty to have a podcast. So with the success of his comedy career and his name recognition on Rogan, Tom started his own podcast, Your Mom's House, with his wife, Christina. With the natural charisma between the two, the boost from Rogan, and the time they got into podcasting, the podcast mostly thrived from their ability to crack jokes and laugh at people. I mean, making fun of people getting hurt is certainly funny. Just watch this video of Tom playing basketball. It is a bit poetic that the guy who is known for laughing at people getting hurt destroys his body trying to defy both gravity and years of neglecting any sort of exercise, then ends up looking like Peter Griffin when he falls. Seemingly at the same time, Tom's financial and physical situation improved. He was in a lot better shape and their podcast was booming, getting big enough that they started their own podcast network. With this network, Tom started other shows with comedians such as Bert Kreischer, the Two Bears, One Cave podcast. While not as successful as Your Mom's House, it definitely brought a lot of eyes, but maybe not the eyes that they had expected. Now look, Tom is not a hack. I mean, he's headlining festivals like the Great Outdoor Comedy Festival in Spokane, Washington. And I can see that this is absolutely true thanks to Ground News. Ground News is an app and website that gathers related news stories from around the world in one place so readers can compare coverage on any news story. Now, stories like this one are fairly inconsequential, but what about more serious stories like Elon Musk and J.K. Rowling's reaction to Scotland's new hate crime law? Ground News will let you see exactly how many articles are covering this story, the breakdown of the bias, and even compare headlines by outlet. It's a platform that naturally just creates less polarization and more objective facts when looking at news. They make it super easy to differentiate coverage on the same story and point out sensationalism from more credible reporting. They're also fully nonpartisan and independent, which makes it easy to stay informed and not get wrapped up in the bipartisan political nonsense of today's world.
So, here's the thing. I fucking hate Trump.
So guys, if you go to the link in the description or go to ground.news/ghostgum, you can subscribe to get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage subscription, which is the one I use. But plans also start at less than $1 a month, so it's super affordable. Make sure you go to Ground News and use my code NOW. It's consistent across the celebrity world that the more disconnected a celebrity is to the average person, the less likable they tend to be. The more down-to-earth celebrities are always more beloved. But most of the time, the ones who aren't get away with it, at least for a while, because they don't have to interact with a public audience, apart from rehearsed talk shows that make me want to vomit. Eventually, if they do get exposed as bad people, it's because they're so out of touch with how regular humans interact. Because they can stay inside their elite bubble and never interact with us poors, as Tom might put it. See, this might work when you're James Corden or Ellen DeGeneres, but it doesn't exactly work when you're a podcasting comedian, because there's a much more direct relationship to your audience. For example, everyone knows Joe Rogan loves DMT and elk hunting because he talks a lot for his job. People don't even watch him know that. But despite Rogan being worth more than $250 million, he somehow manages to stay relatable to the average person, which is why he's so successful. Even if he can be a little out of touch sometimes, he understands what it's like to not have millions in the bank. Most of the time. See, when you're rich and you talk to other rich people about watches, private jets, and luxury cars, they get it. When you talk to your audience of average people about these things, they probably at best don't care and at worst stop listening. That's what Tom Segura and Bert Kreischer did exclusively on their podcast. They are comedians who want to live the lifestyles of rappers, which is fine, but I would say over 99% of the people watching this podcast can't relate to a story about getting drunk on a private jet, then ending up in a Rolex store and buying a $25,000 watch. Because Two Bears, One Cave went from two comedians shooting the shit and watching funny videos to two comedians talking about their expensive and luxurious lifestyle, the fans started calling him out for this. And instead of doing what he should have done, which was ignore it or maybe looked at it and silently taken the criticism, Tom went full fuck you guys, you are out of touch, this is my podcast, I can do whatever I want. Responding to comments, raging at his audience. All great things to do when you're trying to win over people that you've spent years culminating. So not only was Tom talking about his expensive lifestyle, but he also had this elitist attitude about himself which he refused to back down on. It doesn't help that Tom is also constantly joking about and making fun of poor people and calling people who criticize him poors. But those are just jokes, right? It's satire. Now take all that information about the poors and everything like that and watch this clip. Tell me that this is satire.
I'm struggling with rent this month. Figure it the f out, okay? Like, don't make my life be a problem for your life. Just know that it's your mindset and you're thinking like a f***ing loser, but you don't have to.
You don't.
You can change the way you think, but you have to accept the way you're thinking right now is not going to get you anywhere. You're being bitter, you're being petty, you're insecure, you're not confident.
I'm not sure if he's trying to be a motivational hustler guy, but there is zero comedy in this, in my opinion. And when Bert Kreischer, of all people, is looking at you like this, that's when you know you have said some dumb shit. People think Tom hates poor people because he makes fun of them all the time, and at first it's pretty obvious he was joking. But the more he went on with this joke, the more people thought it was more of a half joke. You know, something that's framed like a joke, but is really just what that person believes. Because even if you're clearly serious, but claim you were joking, you can get away with anything. Well, almost anything. It doesn't really work when you berate and lose your mind at minimum wage employees just trying to earn money to bring home to their families. That's exactly what happened when Tom Segura had his infamous airport meltdown. This incident has been documented extensively. It was all over Twitter, and it was kind of a changing point in Tom's podcasting career. Now picture this. Tom Segura is boarding a flight when, his bag needs to be checked because there's no room on the plane, which by the way is a super common thing to happen on busy flights. The flight attendant will say, hey, there's no room in the carry-on, we'll check your bag for free. And 99% of people would be like, okay, whatever, I'll check it, and be on their way. But not Tom Segura. Do they know who he is? He's best friends with Joe Rogan. He has lots of money. He flies privately, normally. He's friends with Joe Rogan, okay? So he pulled a Ben Stiller and Meet the Parents and did what any normal person would do in this situation. Act like a child and throw a tantrum. Although in this case, it was on Twitter. Let me quote from Tom himself. Dumb from American Air made me gate check my bag so she feels the little power she has in her life. I get it. you win this round. But this wasn't bad enough. When people started to call him out, he needed to double down, calling everyone who criticized him poor. You're broke! You're fucking poor! And said that their families are poor for a reason. Responding to random fans on Twitter, showing his contempt for them. This is comedic genius here. Great stuff from Tom Segura. This meltdown was so bad that people in Tom's circle had family members reach out to them asking if he was okay. Now let's say you give Tom Segura the benefit of the doubt here. Let's say this was an elaborate joke. He's just pretending to rant about poor people. He's calling this lady a as a bit and tagging American Airlines in that tweet. It's all a goof. It's all a gag. None of it's real. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that is what he was going for here. His fans hated this. I mean, he was clowned all over the internet, with people being like, look at this old, miserable, out-of-touch loser having a meltdown about the smallest inconvenience. Now, this would be pathetic if it was just a regular civilian like you or me. Except Tom is literally a comedian. I'm not one of the 1,000 comedians out there, but it doesn't seem like this whole poors thing is working anymore. People aren't looking at Tom making fun of poor people and being like, ha, yeah, I hate poor people too. They're looking at it and being like, damn, this guy seems like kind of a jerk. It seems he'd be better to just give up on the whole poor thing. From a public image perspective, it makes you come across as a bitter and almost cruel person. An angle you typically take for this joke is something like playing a character of somebody who's rich and famous while also being an over-the-top, insufferable asshole. The reason why Curb Your Enthusiasm works is Larry David can laugh at himself. He's the butt of the joke most of the time. The audience watches and go, damn, that guy's a bit neurotic. This airport meltdown could have been a sketch and the joke would be on Tom being an asshole instead of just letting them check his bag and move on. Except it's not a sketch. This grown man had a public meltdown and called some lady a I don't know how many times because she made him check his bag. It's easy to see why people think Tom legitimately hates poor people. And if that's the case, that's probably the most elitist thing I've ever heard. Now, this might be justifiable if Tom was poor at some point. He must know what it's like, which is why this joke is about wanting to bring people out of poverty, I guess. That's why he gave the motivational speech. Well, you'll be pleased to know that Tom grew up in a very humble manner. His dad was the vice president of Merrill Lynch, which is an investment management branch of the Bank of America. So, translation, Tom grew up filthy rich. And it seems he still carries that spoiled brat attitude around today. Imagine being a stand-up comedian and thinking that you're better than anybody else. Especially when you don't even really tell jokes anymore. You just talk about how rich you are and how much you love cars and private jets. He's really a comedian in name only right now. Imagine if I started making unironic hustle videos on this channel and one day people started saying to me, hey, can you go back to making stuff that I actually want to watch and came here for? And instead of being like, you guys are right, I called everyone stupid pores for criticizing me. It's one thing to change your content. It's another thing to change your content and call everyone stupid who used to watch your content. It's like, brother, you cultivated this audience. You can't be mad at them for liking your old stuff. It's weird because with Bert Kreischer, with everything you can say about his lying, his annoyingness, his unfunny jokes, he's not an asshole to his fans. All the interactions I've ever seen or heard about with Bert Kreischer have been good, and other comedians tend to like Bert even if they do spike him with Molly like Ari Shaffir. With Tom, he comes across as such an asshole who detests his fans so much that nobody likes him. Even other comedians don't seem to like him. Why would you listen to a podcast of somebody who detests you? This comedian, I use that word very loosely, is acting like he's a 16th century king and can't stand the poor people around him. Therefore, he wants to live up in his high castle where he doesn't have to look at them. The high castle in this instance being the Hollywood Hills. Tom basically told anybody who had any criticism of him, his attitude, or his podcast to leave and not watch. This is a situation where you should be careful what you wish for, because if you tell people not to watch, they just won't watch. Recently, Tom's podcast network lost Nadav, an employee who had worked there for 7 years. Keep in mind this happened after Steve-O was joking with Danny Brown, alluding to the idea they don't treat their employees great. And while they're definitely still pulling views on the channel, it's safe to say the podcast has peaked. It's one thing to naturally decline, but it's another thing to call your audience poor losers and then being shocked that you don't have an audience anymore. But how is Tom's comedy? That's what it's all about, man. I said he doesn't really do comedy anymore, but that's not entirely true. He had a new comedy special, and it's not good. I mean, it's not poppy, but this is coming from a comedian who flies private and when he doesn't throws a temper tantrum. I'm expecting a masterpiece here, and in my opinion, this is pretty bad. It feels lazy, the production value is not what I'd expect from a guy worth as much as Tom. And don't get me wrong, it's not unwatchable, it's just super boring. And people who've seen it seem to agree with me. Now recently it seems that the pores have got to Tom and he started to change the way he speaks on podcasts. Because, surprise, being a rich elitist douche doesn't really work in comedy, especially when people don't find you funny. It seems he's trying to be a bit more humble, and you know what? People clowning on you for being an out-of-touch asshole is probably a humbling experience. So I'm not surprised he's toned down this bit. He even acknowledged the airport meltdown thing and how he handled it maybe wasn't the best. It could also be the fact that the numbers aren't exactly used to be, which, to be fair, numbers are down for almost all podcasts compared to their pandemic and pre-pandemic numbers, but there is a correlation that should be noted. It's weird comparing the old Rogan crew like Tom Segura and Brendan Schaub with the new Rogan crew. Look at how much more these guys are liked versus the old ones. And that might be a video in the future. Has Tom Segura experienced a downfall the same as Brendan Schaub? No, not even close. He's not failing financially like Schaub, but he's not exactly thriving like he used to be. It's not like Tom isn't beyond saving, although I will say it's tough to regain a fan base that you told to leave. But Tom cultivated this fan base because of his comedy, not because of his luxurious lifestyle. But who knows? Maybe I'm just a poor. I grew up with washcloths in the house. My parents didn't work as higher ups at any company, let alone a company that makes $1 gabillion a year like Tom's dad. But if being a poor means I'm not a miserable, materialistic, and unlikable dude like Tom, maybe I'm happy I'm a poor.